Without any further ado, it's my great pleasure. Please help me in welcoming Pearl Dexter.
Thank you for having me here. It's been a pleasure. I saw Bev at the 3rd Street third Thursday a few months ago and asked her if she wanted some help, and I'm glad to be here. Nice to see my cousin here and my friend Mohammed came from Waterford. Wallingford. But the last bit of tea that we drank today came all the way from Sri Lanka because he was there visiting a tea plantation. Some friends of mine over there have one. We all become friends in the tea world. And he brought it back today, and so it was really special because before I came here today, I actually brewed most of the tea at home, and I put it in a concentrated form, brought it in hot pots, brought hot water heater, and plus they had hot water here going, and so we got all that tea going, and that's why we could get so much out right away. It's just that when you wanted thirds that we were having but I'm thrilled to be here, and tea is my world, and even though I'm somewhat retired. And another special friend of mine is here, Mary Jo Tribber, who I think probably a lot of you folks know her. And when I knew I wanted to sell the magazine, I had it for 18 years, but we always started it with the intention of selling it. I didn't sell it for a couple of $1 million, but you know, it gave me a passport around the globe, and that was what was important. And I learned more about tea than I ever thought I could learn. And when I think of what I did back in the days when I had the tea room, I thought I knew something. Oh my goodness. Well, if you see this issue, Mary Jo is featured in it because she's been a good and dear friend of mine and has gone back to the tea room days, and she and her mom used to come there, and we had a great time sitting by the fire. And
This is Mary Jo right back here hosting the Mexico table.
So I don't really know where to begin, but I think I'm going to just talk about some of the customs. I really don't know the customs of the tea in Lebanon, although I know that it's a Middle Eastern country, and of course they would be drinking tea, because they even grow tea in the Middle East. And when I get carried away on tea, you know, I just can't stop. But if you have questions after I'm finished, I'll take questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll find them out and email you later. But in Denmark, for instance, we did a feature on Denmark. The magazine is now defunct, but the people who bought it, when they bought it a couple of years ago, it gave me the great opportunity to go to Nepal for 6 weeks and help the Nepalese market their tea to Europe and America. After my magazine, I always thought was kind of artsy, and you know, I always tried to feature artists and poets, and I took unknown writers because I think all of us have a story. And when they came out with their first issue, I was kind of disappointed because this gentleman is holding a plastic cup, and no one I know in the tea world would have consumed tea out of a plastic cup. And they later went on to just have an online publication called The Daily Tea, and they're now only doing an annual. And I did write a story in this one called Tea from Heavenly Places. And this is not for sale because I think it's the only one I brought. But it's been a journey for me, and my husband started it with me 20 years ago. I met him about 23 years ago. He passed away last year from MS, but he was my greatest fan. And he said to me, I heard that you talk about tea. That must be like listening to grass grow. He went to a talk I was giving at a museum down in Madison at the time, and that's where he had come from, Madison and Guilford area. And he was just so fascinated. And then one day he came home after we were married, and he said, I think we should start a magazine. I just saw a magazine on buttons. And they had a magazine on beer, and of course you've seen the wine magazines. So he went up to Yukon, did some research, and back then, you know, we only had this little tiny Apple computer, which is probably in museums now. And we started this magazine, and then we just went on and on with it for the 18 years. It was a joy, and even later when he couldn't work with me, he was always my greatest fan and my greatest critic. There were times in the early years that he'd actually go into my computer and he'd correct my English. That used to kind of annoy me, but you know, we had to have it as perfect as we could. But I have to tell you, in every publication I've ever read, in every publication we've ever done, nothing ever comes out perfect. Because there's only one perfect thing happening. And even the people in Pennsylvania, the Amish, they drop a stitch. The people in Japan, they don't do things perfectly because they realize that we can never be perfect. So when I find a mistake after we publish the magazine, or after we print it, I'd say to the people that were working with me, okay, we're going to read it again and again, but we're not going to get upset when we see a spello or a comma in the wrong place. We're just going to celebrate that it's here. It's a new birth. So, when we think of a new birth, this country was a new birth. We came from all parts of the world, but you know, all those rogues from England that wanted to get out, or they were in prison and they let the prisons open the gates, they all came over here. And so we're kind of a melting pot of people. And the English wanted to control tea and who was going to get it. And if I just back up a little bit, tea was first discovered in China many, many years ago, and they say it's about 2737 BC. There's not a book that I know of that doesn't give you a different date. They always say 2737 BC. And I think it's kind of interesting because that supposedly is around the time of the Great Biblical Flood, and then we never hear about tea until the 2nd or 3rd century in China in a Chinese dictionary. And then it started to grow in other places, and then they discovered that it was growing also in the western part, the eastern part of India. But that's a whole other lecture because the Opium Wars and everything else. But when England kind of like had a monopoly on bringing tea from all around the world to their shores, then they would send it out to us, and they wanted to tax us. But they didn't just want to tax us on tea, they were taxing us on everything. You couldn't make your own shawls and sell them unless they were for the people that lived with you or worked on your farm. Everything was being taxed. So it was just another thing, and it was one thing that just was the straw that broke the camel's back, and you know, we had that big Boston Tea Party throwing the tea in the harbor. But along with the Boston Tea Party, there were other tea parties all up and down the East Coast, from Connecticut to South Carolina. And we featured that actually in one of these magazines. I can't
Down with King George! Yeah! Sorry. After we had the tea revolution, or the Revolutionary War, guess what was the first thing that the Americans taxed when they became the United States of America? Tea. And we, of course, when we started that war, we didn't have any ships, so they had to take the ships from the rich people that had ships going to China to get silk and spices and other things of that sort. And when they came back, when the war was over, one of the first things that we did was we went to China and we brought tea back. And they made so much money on just the tea that it was incredible. And they also brought back silk and spices, and they eventually, in the mid-1800s, I'm so proud of what Americans have done for the world of tea, actually. And what they did is they took an old schooner and they redesigned it, somebody redesigned it, and they made it into what was called a clipper ship. So the clipper ship sailed the seas from here to China, and then the British got in on it, and we started racing them, and whoever got their tea back first, you know, would get a big prize for their tea. It's like the tea that Mohammed brought to me today, you know. No one in this country probably has it other than, unless you, do you bring it in to sell?
No.
So we're the only ones who have that at the moment, and it's just a treasure. And So eventually, Americans realized how expensive it was to go and get the tea. They also realized how expensive it was to buy it in the days of sailing back and forth. Well, you know, they started to lock tea up in little boxes because they didn't want anybody to steal it. They didn't want their maidservants to steal it. And if you thought that decaffeinated tea was a new thing of the past century, wrong, because back then, the tea dregs were given to the slaves or the other people in the households, and so they were drinking the decaffeinated teas. Because it's a very simple way to decaffeinate tea. If you have a problem with the caffeine in tea, and if you're using a tea bag, you just simply pour the water over the tea, leave it for about 30 seconds, pour that water off, but only pour enough to just cover the tea bag or the loose tea. Pour that off, pour the hot water in again, and you'll have a probably 98%, 97% decaffeinated cup or decaffeinated pot of tea. So the Americans contributed so much to the world of tea, but it was the British and the Dutch that brought tea to America first. And even before the British and the Dutch brought it to America, the Italians, they were bringing it, well, probably just as Muhammad did as an explorer and as a traveler. They brought it back to Italy in the 1500s. And it did not become their first beverage of choice like it did in England. In England, they actually replaced coffee. They took over coffee because when they brought it over, they brought it to this one place in London called Lloyd's of London, which was a coffee house, and it was also a place where people would gather, and it was mainly men. They used to drink tea then, when they started to drink it, out of these big oak casks. Well, you know, the poor British lady of the countryside, she was a little peckish one day around 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and she decided, well, I want my tea now. Because, you know, it wasn't acceptable for women to go out like men did. They couldn't go out in singly or even with each other. So they started the tradition of afternoon tea, but the Dutch were doing it a few hundred years or so before that. Well, of course, you know, we like to emulate the British because there were a lot of people that came to this country in the early days that came from England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, Holland, and so we took on those customs. Even in New York City, back in the 1600s, before we had what was called afternoon tea, there were special water pumps in the city down near Wall Street that you could go and get your special water to brew your tea in. There were fanatics about tea then, just like there are now. They would have tea gardens all over Manhattan and tea gardens all over England. And they still do have tea gardens all over England. And the specialty tea industry in America started in the late 80s, early 90s, and by one of the most revered men of tea that I know, John Harney. And the tea that you were drinking from the Mexico table came from his company, and they started out in Connecticut. There were a lot of tea companies that started out in Connecticut. Bigelow is still here. Harney and Sons, the people live in Connecticut, but their tea factory is now in Millerton, New York. There was Tapley Tea, had their home here for a long time, and Specialties, which became incorporated into Tivana. There are so many things in America, in Connecticut, that we have to be thankful for as far as our contribution to the world of tea. And when we back up a little bit, the famous tea bag, well, that was first used in about 1910. Some gentleman sent his tea to somebody to taste, and they poured hot water over the little silk pouch that the loose tea was in, and the tea bag was then used. Well, the tea bag paper was invented right here in the state of Connecticut by a company called the Dexter Corporation. And when we started the magazine back in 1994, we had, I'm just going to see if I can find, this was our first issue of the magazine. And it's not a real teapot, but it's a glass teapot that the people at the Dexter Corporation had, and they gave me the image. Well, we used that image for the first issue, and then when we went to press, I went up to New Hampshire at that time, and when we came back, I was so proud, and I took it to this Chinese restaurant that I like to go to. And the woman's looking at it, and all of a sudden she goes like this. And I said, why are you doing that? Well, the printer took the Chinese symbol, the T, and printed it upside down. And his remark was, well, you know, how many people are going to know that? I never used that printer again. But the Dexter Corporation, I thought, was no relative to me. I soon found out that it was. And there was a person from the Dexter Corporation that in our lineage of people, I couldn't find one certain person. I went to a graveyard in Foster or Situate, Rhode Island, and was in this old graveyard for the Dexters. And there was this area that was all grown over. There was the man that was related to the Dexters in Windsor Locks. Back in 1904, there in this country, we then decided that we were going to popularize iced tea. Now, some people like to think that iced tea just got invented in 1904 at the St. Louis World's Fair, but it wasn't so. And when I started the magazine, there was a gentleman from San Francisco that called me up and told me all about how they were drinking iced tea back in the 1860s. Well, a few years later, I was at the Tea Association of the USA in New York, and they let me go through their file cabinets. And sure enough, I found some old newspaper articles, and they talked about drinking iced tea. Well, if it wasn't for the Americans drinking iced tea in America, our sales and our business of tea would probably be very low, because probably 90% of the tea that's consumed in this country is iced tea. And you can't go anywhere down south where they don't offer it. And yeah, they add sugar to it. Now, people in the tea world, and the people that I've met around the world, and the people who've gotten used to tea, say that, you know, tea has enough taste without putting sugar or anything else in it. But we say in this business, do anything you want with it. If you like sugar in it, put sugar in it. The Russians put jam in it. Do whatever you like. The one thing is, you just have to brew it properly. And brewing it properly means you don't brew it too long. Because when you steep tea, if you steep it too long, it doesn't get any stronger, it just gets bitter. It just gets more bitter. Now, France, they had tea rooms all over Paris, and we did a couple of stories about tea rooms in Paris. But when we wrote this book, Tea with Presidential Families, we tried to include as many countries as possible, because one of the things that every presidential family has done, and every first lady has done, is have a tea party, going back to George Washington. And tea is considered by many, many people a much more civilized drink than coffee, because we are usually relaxing over it. We're not on the go. We're not grabbing a cup and running out the door. So it gives us so many health benefits, not just the antioxidants that are in it, but it gives us a sense of peace and serenity that we don't find in many other beverages.
Good. Thank you very much for your wonderful story.